All right, I think we will go ahead and begin with the introduction. I want to welcome everyone tonight for our Great Wednesday webinar series. We are thrilled to have Jeanne Bishop with us this evening. And let me do a brief introduction to Jeanne. Jeanne Bishop is a public defender, human rights advocate, writer, speaker, teacher, and mom. Since the 1990 murders of Bishop's sister, Nancy Bishop Langert, her husband, and their unborn baby, she has advocated for forgiveness and reconciliation, violence prevention, and reform of the criminal justice system to make it more merciful. Bishop is the author of Change of Heart, Justice, Mercy, and Making Peace with My Sister's Killer, and Grace From the Rubble, Two Fathers' Road to Reconciliation After the Oklahoma City Bombing. And Jeanne, we are so glad you are here with us tonight. We look forward to this evening, and I'm going to turn it over to Neil now. And for folks, let me say this: if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. You can send them directly to me if you would like to do that, and then I will funnel those to Neil. We'll have about 20 minutes toward the end of a Q&A session. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Roger. Jeanne, it's a real joy for me to have a conversation with you tonight. And of course, I first met you when my family and I lived in Minnesota, and I was thinking about, it's easy to kind of roll right past and say you're a public defender, but I remember hearing a presentation by a public defender at the University of St. Thomas Law School in Minneapolis once, and talked to a room full of law students about what his daily professional life was like. And for someone who doesn't know a lot about the legal world or only few details about the criminal justice system, I mean, it was really eye-opening. It was unsettling. It was, you talked about the number of cases he had to handle, the resources that he had at hand to deal with those. I was wondering if you could just paint, in your own words, your own picture of what it's like to be a public defender. And do you think of that as a calling? Is that part of your calling?
Well, first of all, Neil, thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be talking with you tonight. How I became let me just start with how I became a public defender. I didn't start out as that. I started out right out of law school as a corporate attorney. And it's so funny now because all I do is talk in front of people all the time as a public defender. But I think in law school, I thought, I can't get up in front of people and talk, and my voice will shake. I'll do corporate law. I'll be behind a desk and working on documents. And of course, I was absolutely dreadful at it because I didn't care about it deeply. It wasn't deeply meaningful to me. What I really loved doing was the pro bono cases that I got to do on the side as an attorney working for Central American refugees seeking asylum. Arts organizations that needed help incorporating things like that, where you could see a real impact on a real person. And so consequently, I was really cheating my employer because I wasn't putting my whole heart into what I was doing. And then came the murder of my sister at the age of 25 and her husband, Richard, who was 29. And to compound the tragedy, she was 3 months pregnant with what would have been their first baby. And I had already lived a few years longer than she had when her life was taken. And that to me was akin to something that the author and lawyer and hero of criminal justice, Scott Turow, wrote once. It was this yellow stripe drawn between everything that had come before and everything that came after, right? It was just a searing reminder that life is short. And it is this gift that God has given us, and it's not to be squandered on anything that is not deeply meaningful and that doesn't demand of you your whole heart. And so within months, I had left the corporate law job and became a public defender. And from the moment I started doing it, it felt as natural as breathing, because I was doing this thing that Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 25, when he said, when you visit the prisoner, you're visiting me. Mm-hmm. And I could see in the face of my clients, the face of Christ. And in their mothers, the mothers that would come to the courtroom and not be able to touch their child or help them in any way, but just to be there to show that love. And I saw in them mother, that Mary, the mother of God, right?
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And it's been such a calling in that way. It was what I always should have done. And I'm so grateful to be doing it now in my third decade, starting my third decade as a public defender.
Wow, it's a, it's a hope. I hate that it happened out of tragic circumstances, but it is also a reminder to other people in their lives that they can discover this at any point along the way. Like if you don't get it right early on,
Yes.
you have an opportunity to discover this somewhere along the way.
Yes, they talk about that still small voice of God. For me, it was more like, by the time I became a public defender, it's more like a megaphone of
Right.
like. This is
So
what
I remember seeing you not officially as a public defender, but in a dramatic presentation as a public defender. You were doing this kind of dramatic presentation with our mutual friend, Mark Osler, a former prosecutor who teaches criminal law, and he was a member of my previous congregation in Minnesota in the Twin Cities. And the presentation brought those of us who were watching it into a courtroom as jurors. And the setting was Jesus, having already been found guilty, would soon be sentenced based on the jury's reaction to what we were about to hear. And you were the role of, you were defending Jesus. Our mutual friend was the prosecutor. I think I seem to recall there was a real judge, and then you call different characters up there like Peter and other people that we're familiar with from the pages of the Gospels. And it was a way of pulling the Passion story into our world, into our life today. And the uncomfortable question that was then presented to the audience is, in the jury box, is whether you would vote to put Jesus to death. And I remember, those of us who are Christians listening to that would, of course, say that Jesus was an innocent man. And the whole exercise, though, felt very uncomfortable, as if you wanted to hit rewind and figure out what went wrong with our human institutions to bring us to that point of deliberation. It felt wrong to be participating in it, kind of like when a congregation is asked to say, crucify him during Holy Week and the Passion story. And I'm wondering if, did folks ever talk to you after they heard one of those presentations about their discomfort with having been put in that position, or, how it made them wrestle with their faith versus kind of things they see, facts on the ground? Or
Yes, they did. And that was the brilliance of Mark Osler, who is not just a brilliant attorney and a brilliant law professor, but a brilliant strategist when it comes to law reform. He went from growing up in Detroit, the Detroit area, and going to law school at Yale and becoming a prosecutor, to going down to Texas to teach. His first teaching job was at Baylor in Waco, Texas. And what he noticed pretty quickly was that if you were running for any political office, whether it was dog catcher or mayor or governor, you had to have two things. You needed the commercial showing you and your wife and children walking hand in hand out of church on a Sunday morning with a gun strapped to your hip, and you needed to support the death penalty. And what he could not figure out was this juxtaposition of supporting, being a Christian and having this fervent support for capital punishment, because the Savior we worship was an innocent man put to death in the Romans' particularly ghastly form of capital punishment, crucifixion. And so his brilliant idea was to put Jesus on trial under modern law in Texas, when we did it in Texas, or Virginia, when we did it in Virginia, which was then the second most prolific capital punishment state in the nation. Just abolished the death penalty, by the way, very recently. And so we did it in all these different states under that law. And the purpose of it was to do exactly what you just said, which is to make people feel uncomfortable, to make them wrestle with this idea of, well, these are the bad people, so it's okay, to put them to death, but not Christ. He was this sinless, innocent, Son of God. And it wasn't to beat them over the head or to make them believe it, but to get them to wrestle with their own faith and convictions with this scourge of capital punishment.
I still remember it to this day. And of course, it's one thing to wrestle with what can happen to an innocent person within the criminal justice system, but pondering how that system works now or how it should work in the future when dealing with, for those who, for example, admit their guilt, maybe admit to some horrendously violent crime. And that's a really different conversation. That's a different struggle in people's minds and with their faith too. And you've dealt with that in your own life because of the story about your sister's murder. And I'm going to ask you in just a moment to tell that story. But first, picking up on my previous reference to the Passion of Jesus, I want to point out that Palmer, the name of our church, is a family name, but it also referred historically to someone who returned from the Holy Land with a palm frond as a sign that they had gone on a pilgrimage. We've picked up on that, and we've adopted Palm Sunday as our feast day. So that's the day when we celebrate who we are as a congregation, following Jesus into Jerusalem and into our own world, and trying to look at our lives as a community and as individuals through that lens. And I mentioned that because as I've heard you tell that story about your sister to others, I hear you doing some of the same thing. And maybe we can come back to that later when we talk about forgiveness. But with that as a preface, how did you first hear that your sister had been killed?
I heard it in my church on Palm Sunday morning, Neil. On the night before April 7th, 1990, my sister and her husband and my mom and dad and I were all out celebrating at this Italian restaurant on Clark Street in Chicago with this joyous, happy news that Nancy was pregnant. Because even though she was the youngest of me and my sisters, she was the first one that was going to be a mom. So this is my parents' first grandchild, my first little niece or nephew. And we were all just over the moon with joy. And I was living downtown and going to this big downtown Presbyterian church, Fourth Presbyterian in Chicago, where I sang in the choir. And Nancy and my parents went to this, church out in the suburbs. And so when I hugged her goodbye that night, I said, "I'll see you tomorrow," meaning after church, not knowing that was the last time on earth I'd ever see her alive. So the next morning I got up, I went to church, I put on my choir robe, I had my little palm branch, I've got my choir, folder full of music, and I'm ready to walk down the aisle, and the church secretary comes to me and puts her hand on my arm and says, "There's a phone call." And I was so stunned, I thought, well, could you take a message? Because I'm about to go sing. And she said, "No, you need to come with me." And I knew something then was very wrong, but I had no idea that it would be my father on the phone in the church office telling me Nancy and Richard have been killed. And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Somebody killed them."
Wow. And I seem to recall, what were you told about the circumstances around that?
Absolutely nothing, because at that point, all they knew is that these bodies, my father had gone over to their house after church. And when they didn't answer the door, he was very troubled, and he had a key because he actually owned the townhouse where they were living at the time. And when he walked in, he saw the broken glass on the door and the light on in the basement, and looked down and saw Nancy and Richard there, dead, covered in blood, and didn't know even what the cause of death was. It wasn't until I went out to the police station in the town where this happened that we were told that they had been shot to death. And that was like this shadow of evil cast on a family that had lived in such privilege and safety and happiness, to think that someone could actually point a gun at my beautiful sister, the most generous, life-loving, happy, sweet, hopeful young woman on the face of the earth, on the cusp of everything that she wanted to come true. We were about to move into their first house that they were going to own, and have their first baby, and so much in love, and so looking forward to the future, and to have that all blown away in a moment, it just seemed incomprehensible to me, the evil of that.
And to even compound that, didn't you learn later? I mean, and what was I don't know what the right word is, not purpose behind, but what was the person seeking? Or later you found out some more details about the circumstances, although that took a while, right?
It took decades, because until he finally confessed to me after I reached out to him to tell him I'd forgiven him. But it was shrouded in mystery because there was nothing taken. It was a break-in, clearly, but because Nancy had cast her paycheck that day, and all $500 of it was found strewn on the ground. Not a penny was taken, nothing was taken. it was, and Richard had been shot execution style in the back of his head. Nancy tragically was shot in her pregnant stomach twice and left to bleed to death. But it looked like an assassination of this innocent young couple, this happy couple with no enemies.
Yeah, for no reason. Yeah. And then how long did it take for there to be an arrest? And that must have been a strange time to know nothing, and then,
Yeah, it was six
something-
long months, and it was an absolutely terrible time because all these outlandish theories were being floated around, and none of them made sense to me. And as time went on and there were no arrests made, I just felt that the trail was getting colder and colder, and that whoever had done this might escape justice forever. And that's why I was so shocked when one night I came home to my apartment in Chicago and the phone was ringing, and it was a reporter from the CBS station wanting my reaction to the arrest of my sister's murder. And I said, "What arrest?" And he said, "There's a teenage boy in custody in the Winnetka police station."
Wow. How old was he at the time of the crime?
He was 1 month short of his 17th birthday. He was 16 years old, a junior in high school, the same high school where my son, also a junior, my son Stephen, attends school right now.
Mhm.
He
Did
lived
you-
3 blocks away from them.
Wow. But did not know them. I mean, you wouldn't have known them.
Did not know them.
Yeah. How did did you go to the trial? I mean, how did you walk through that process?
I went to the trial every day because just the way the circumstances were, I was the only member of my immediate family that was not as called as a witness at the trial. So I
Okay.
was the only one that was, could be there every day.
Mhm.
And it was excruciating to see her clothes hung up because she had such beautiful taste in clothes. She always dressed so beautifully, and to see this silk top she was wearing riddled with bullets and covered in blood, to see the gun held up. Some of the photos were so inflammatory that the judge wouldn't allow them. The state had tried to introduce some of the photos, including the autopsy photo showing my little niece or nephew in the room, dead. And to see him walk out kind of cocky, take the stand and lie and say, that he hadn't done it and trying to blame someone else. It contradicted a mountain of evidence against him. The jury didn't buy it, and they did, after 2 hours of deliberation, convict him. And he got the sentence that you got back then in the state of Illinois if you were a juvenile who did a double homicide, and that's life without parole.
Wow. Is that still the sentence he's under today? I mean, is that?
It is
Changed.
still the sentence he's under, although that will change possibly because in the year 2012, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down the sentence that he's serving, this mandatory sentence of life without parole. The court ruled that you could still give a life sentence to a juvenile, but it can't be a mandatory matter for the judge. There must be a discretion that the judge has to look at all these different factors, including the age of the defendant before imposing that sentence.
How did it feel when you heard that sentence yet too? Like, did you feel like, I don't know what the right word is. I mean, it's not like everything's resolved, but how did it feel at the end of that part?
My mom was sitting next to me on these hard wooden benches where the spectators sat in the courtroom. And when he got that sentence, she turned to me and she said, "We'll never see him again." And I was glad of it at the time. I was fine with that sentence of life without parole. But over time, and this is what I write about in my first book, Change of Heart, and the change of heart is about my change of heart, about him, and about this merciless sentence he was given. I started to have great doubts about the sentence of life without parole. And part of that is because of people like Mark Osler, like Sister Helen Prejean, who you have interviewed,
Right.
In the past, like Bernadine Dorn, my North Star, my moral compass, and to have them all, be opposed to this on the grounds that it does foreclose the possibility of mercy for those who've been rehabilitated, who are remorseful, who can be safely released into society, that you don't just throw people away forever without a second look. And so finally, after many years, I did come to the realization that I was wrong and I needed to tell him, the killer. And I did. I wrote him a letter saying, I forgave you a long time ago and never told you. And I've waited all these years for you to apologize to me. I'm going to go first. I'm sorry. And if you want me to come and see you, I will.
Did he write back, or how did you?
He
what
did.
happened after that?
He did write back. It took a couple of weeks, but I went to my office at the public defender, and there was this big, thick, big envelope that had his name, Biro. His name is David Biro. And his name was up in the left-hand corner in the return address, and my heart started pounding. And for 2 days, I couldn't open it. And so finally, it happened to be actually around that time doing the trial of Jesus with Mark Osler. And I said, I can't, and he opened it, he read it, and he read it to me, and he said, it's good. And he was right. The very first page of the letter said, I know you've waited all these years to hear this. I am guilty. I did kill your sister and her husband, and I'm so sorry. I regret it so much. And in the next 15 pages, front and back of this letter, he traced his whole journey, his change of heart about what he'd done. And he not reached out to me to express his remorse because he thought it might traumatize me to even see his name on it.
Yeah, you wouldn't have heard those words if you hadn't wrote in that letter, right? I mean,
yeah, that's right. He would have waited forever for me. It took me so long.
Now, another thing that took a long time is I seem to recall you said somewhere once that you didn't say his name for a long time, right? Or am I misremembering that?
Oh, for 20 plus years.
Oh, wow.
I called him the murderer, the offender, the juvenile, the intruder. And I did that on purpose because I wanted his name to die and Nancy and Richard's to live. I mean, there's so many tragedies like the Oklahoma City bombing that I write about in my second book, where we know the name of Timothy McVeigh.
Right.
But we can't name a single one of his victims. And I wanted people to know about Julie Marie Welch, the only daughter, youngest child of Bud Welch, my friend, who died in that bombing at the age of 23, just about the same age as my sister. And I wanted, I want her name to live, and his to fade away.
And thinking about, somehow your thinking has changed, and we can talk more about how your Christian faith has impacted a lot of your points along this journey. But just thinking about the sentencing, for example, I think for a lot of American Christians, we get super confused very quickly about the relationship between grace and forgiveness, and time in prison, and a way out of prison, no way out of prison, and on the one hand, just because I use sometimes extreme language to talk about grace, but that doesn't mean I think every prison cell should be opened and everyone should just be set free instantaneously. On the other hand, the notion that there can never be any mercy shown forever, it seems extreme in a different way. I mean, how do you think about those things? How do they fit together, or sometimes they overlap,
Yeah, it is extreme, this idea of throwing people away forever. And if you look in the Bible, it's full of stories of people, murderers, who God used for a purpose. Moses killed a man. He went on the run, and God used him to lead people out into the promised land. King David did a particularly horrible murder. He too cowardly to do it himself. He dispatched, other people to do it for him. It was a murder for hire, to cover up, the fact that he slept with another man's wife, and he had the man killed. Paul, who started out as Saul before he had that road to Damascus moment, was dragging off men, women, and children to be killed. And God used him mightily to spread the gospel of Christ to, so much of the world. So, I mean, the Bible's full of stories like that, of second chances, of the man who's possessed by demons, and he's howling, and they're trying to chain him, and he's living among the tombs, and Jesus cast that out, and there he is, restored in his right mind. And the villagers all kind of can't believe it. And he wants to go with Jesus, and Jesus says, no, stay there and talk about the mercy God's shown you. Meaning, I want you to go home, right? I want you to go back into your community. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about sentences that don't allow for that return, don't allow for that mercy. We have to get rid of those.
Now, you mentioned in the letter that you wrote to him that you said you had forgiven him long ago. When did that happen?
I forgave whoever killed Nancy the day I found out she'd been murdered.
So before you knew
I
anything
was
about it.
sitting in the Winnetka police station, and when I found out she'd been shot to death, the first thing I said, and everyone stared at me as if I were, insane, but the first thing I said was, I don't want to hate anyone.
Right.
And I knew it was because this was evil such as we had never known.
Right.
And you have to respond to evil, right?
Yeah.
You can't not respond to evil. It must be responded to. And I knew that one response to that would be hate and vengeance and a desire for retribution and to get this guy
Right.
and to nail him to the wall. And I thought, if I go into this, adrift into this ocean of hate, it will be endless. There will not be enough hate in the world to pay for this.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew there had to be another way, and it had to be a way guided by Nancy and who she was and what she stood for. And that's what I've tried to live by ever since her death, is to live a life that honors this gift of life that I've been given by God, and also her memory.
I will get to questions in a second, but I just have to say that Mark Osler sent a note to us here in the chat said that you've first said the name of the killer in an Episcopal church, Holy Comforter in Richmond, Virginia.
Yeah, I did. And that was such a sacred moment. And
Did you know you were going to do that, or was it a surprise to yourself?
I knew I was going to do it, and I'll tell you how I did. I'm a Presbyterian, and we start our worship services every Sunday with a prayer of confession. That's the first thing we do is confess. And I knew I was going to be speaking to this church along with Mark Osler that night at Holy Comforter in Richmond. And I thought, before I do anything in this church, I have to confess treating this young man who has a name as a non-person for decades. And the only way to, what's the word, propitiate, expurgate, whatever that word is, I needed to do that before anything else.
I'm curious, when you talk about some things, choices you made, ways you've walked through this, trying to honor your sister, and you mentioned, a larger family, and it makes me think of some other people I've known who've done courageous things in other avenues, other lanes, but they do those things led by their faith, but that doesn't mean that all of their siblings go along, and some of them don't like what they've done, and I'm curious, you don't have to get into, but how has the rest of your family reacted to some of the ways that you've walked through this so publicly?
Yeah, so at the time of my sister's murder, I had a mother, a father, and an older sister all alive. My dad sadly passed away about 17 years ago. My mom is still alive and well, and I have an older sister. My mom just wants nothing to do with this young man. In fact, she's even said that she doesn't care if he's in prison or not. She just doesn't want to think about him. My older sister has been one of the most vocal people for juvenile life sentences, for keeping these people locked up forever, for denying them any mercy. She is very invested in this idea that any remorse he might be showing now is a sham. She's not accepting his apology or his remorse or responsibility, which is very sad. My dad, though, this is very interesting. After he died, my mom asked me to help her clean out one of his file cabinets. Sure. And we were tossing a lot of things, but then I came across this yellow legal pad. And at the top, it said forgiveness in his handwriting. And I was like, what is this? Mm-hmm. And my mom said, oh, he talked to the confirmation class that he taught. He taught the confirmation class at his church in the Chicago's North Shore suburb of Kenilworth. 7th and 8th graders. And he's talking to them about forgiveness. And so here's what his note said. He said, I've had to struggle with forgiveness because I had this tragedy in my family. My daughter and my son-in-law and my grandchild were murdered. And he said, I've learned that forgiveness has two parts. The first part is the letting go of your righteous, justifiable anger over this terrible thing that someone has done to you. He said the second part is harder and steeper and truer to the cross. And that is the letting in, the letting back in to relationship of the person who did this. And when I read that, I thought, oh my goodness, I have got to believe that if he were alive today, he would go with me to Pontiac prison and he would sit across from David Bureau and hear his apology.
What an amazing gift to have discovered. I mean, it's a whole part that a hidden part of his life to you up to that moment.
Yeah, God sends me these things every once in a while. These gifts.
And thinking about forgiveness, I really do believe with my whole heart that forgiveness and a kind of divine justice that will one day right all wrongs within us and around us lies at the heart of Christianity. Healing both the suffering we've endured and the suffering that we've caused in the world around us. And that's a wonderful thing, and that's a hopeful thing. But it doesn't mean that I'm an expert in forgiveness or that it comes easily. And I'm terrible at it. A lot of even when we want to do it, we don't always do it the best way, the right way, or we might not even see the fruit of something that happens. But has that gotten easier for you over time, or do you think it's just as hard now as it always has been?
That is such a great question. What I found, people think that forgiveness is like this one-time thing where you just do it and then you're done, right? And I think it's more akin to my, before COVID, going to this little gym in my town, in this little suburb where I live, every morning and just picking up those weights and lifting them, right? That is this muscle. And the more you use it, the more strong it gets. I mean, I find now that I know immediately that what I need to do is forgive, no matter how ticked off I am or wounded or, whatever it is, that ultimately this is where it has to lead. This is where our, what our Savior commands us to do, right? Because it's good for us. That's why we need to do this.
I wonder, I think the most powerful example of forgiveness that I've ever read about or thought about came in the aftermath of the shooting in the one-room schoolhouse in the Amish community in Pennsylvania back in 2006. And the Amish famously, they kind of circling back around to the Passion again, they famously looked to the example of Jesus who forgave his tormentors from the cross. And they really do believe with their whole heart that they have to do the same. And the one thing, that we didn't see, that story's different. We didn't see how they would have treated the shooter because he didn't survive, later. But we did see how they reached out to his widow, immediately with love. And they told her that they hoped she would stay there because that she would always have good friends in that community. And they were referring to themselves. And I remember in particular how the Amish emerged at the graveside at the shooter's funeral in order to shield his family from the media. I mean, I to this day, I cannot, I get kind of emotional just thinking about that. And I once heard someone say that the Amish, that choose to forgive up front, whether they feel like it or not. And then it's like what you were saying, the work comes later or whatever, but they feel like that's the beginning. Some people say forgiveness is the end of a process. For them, it's the beginning of a process. I know people have different thoughts about that, but I mean, how do you can you kind of relate to their way of thinking about that? Or
Absolutely, I love that. I share your awe of that kind of faith and living it out, and it stands in such stark contrast to someone that I write about in my first book. Remember Carla Faye Tucker? She was a woman in Texas on their death row. And Texas was the state that was executing the most people in the nation regularly. And she was due to be executed. But because she was so rehabilitated, remorseful, converted really to Christianity while in prison, all the guards, the administrators, Pat Robertson, the evangelist, everybody was advocating to then Governor George W. Bush of Texas to commute her death sentence. He decided not to. and she was put to death. And Carla Faye Tucker had two victims, and the brother of one of the victims said, well, I don't know, she's a, really Christian or not. And if she is, and she goes to heaven, I hope when she gets there that my sister kicks her ass, right? That her death wasn't even enough for him, that he still had that anger, right? And, in the Oklahoma City bombing, which I write about in my second book, Grace From the Rubble, the people who were interviewed after Tim McVeigh was executed, they were all interviewed afterwards, and the ones who witnessed it on the closed circuit TV or in person. And we're asked, well, now do you feel better? And they said, no, that they didn't. And it's because there's this hate that's had this focal point, right? Until then, and now without that there, the hate remained, right? But it didn't even have an object to hate anymore.
Yeah,
they were just lost.
Eternal life. I mean, not really, but it seems like it. Yeah. When did you first? Now, have you gone to? You mentioned writing a letter to your sister's murderer, but what about? Did you go beyond writing letters?
Oh, I went to visit him. I mean, until COVID, I was visiting him regularly, and it's really been amazing, Neil, because when I first was going to visit, the guards didn't know who I was.
Wow.
But after a while, the word got around and they started figuring it out. And the other inmates started figuring it out. And I've had guards ask me, why are you doing this?
Wow.
And then I get to give my witness.
Yeah.
Right? My witness that I wouldn't get to do otherwise.
Had they ever experienced that before, or was that brand new to them?
That's a great question. I don't really know. They seemed astonished. So I don't know if that's ever happened before there.
I asked Sister Helen a question about, I think it was a Gallup poll about, the being perplexed by a majority of Americans believing that innocent people had in fact been killed at some point through capital punishment, and yet also a majority of Americans thinking that that it was still good to have capital punishment as part of the criminal justice system, and how you put those two things together in general, but then specifically as a Christian. And I don't know have you ever can you untangle that knot for us, or
Sure, because I live in the state of Illinois.
Okay.
And we had 20 people on our death row exonerated as innocent, factually innocent people, not a technicality, innocent people who were on the verge of being put to death before heroic efforts by, attorneys, law students, journalism students, exoneration projects uncovered the evidence that saved their lives. One of them, the case I worked on, is a man named Verneil Jemerson, never been in trouble in his life, family man, janitor at his local church, was wrongfully accused of a horrific rape and murder. And he was so stricken just by the accusation alone that he could have done such a terrible thing. Can you imagine being on death row, facing the end of your life for something you didn't do? So, and the reason for this is that because the crimes are so heinous, there's this rush to get these guys, find out who did this. And even when the facts start to unravel, prosecutors were so invested in the prosecutions they brought that they couldn't say, you're right, this was a wrongful conviction. Thank God that changed. We abolished our death penalty in the state of Illinois several years ago. And crime didn't skyrocket. People saw that we were risking doing something that you can't undo. And that is, once you take a human life, you can't give it back. So we need to abolish the death penalty, not just in my state, but everywhere.
Were you surprised that Virginia, being the first Southern state to, were you surprised that happened, or that it was Virginia as the first?
You know what? I have to say, I wasn't surprised, but I was overjoyed. Yeah. And the reason I wasn't surprised is that the people that Mark Osler and I met when we did our very first trial of Jesus in the state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, we met people like Craig Anderson and Michael Stone and all of these people who were working in the faith community, in journalism, in law, in the community, and saying that we are better than this. And, particularly in a city like Richmond, where they have this, the church sits on an avenue called Monument Avenue, and the monuments are Confederate generals.
Right.
And Richmond was a slave port. And if you overlay the states that still have the death penalty with the states that were slave states, it's almost a perfect match, which tells you something about the origins of our modern death penalty and the shameful history of it. So it's the first Southern state, I believe, to abolish its death penalty, and I think it's going to be a model for the others to follow.
Here in Texas, we've been learning, certainly locally, about kind of beyond, well, the end of slavery in an official capacity, but its transformation into prisoner leasing here. And there was a mass grave that was found in out, near Houston that related to that, and so it's been in the news a bit. And I went to a presentation at Rice where one of the historians was saying, in some ways, the prison leasing system was even worse, in the sense that you could work a man to death and know that he'd be replaced instantaneously the next day. So even in the absence of capital punishment, to have a system where you literally work people to death, that's a different form of that.
Wow.
Several years ago, Northwestern University published a long profile of you and your work and the story about your sister. And the person who wrote it, sort of in the middle of it, said, "I kept asking myself as a Christian, could I be as strong and merciful as Jeanne Bishop? I have my doubts." And I love that she put such a very honest response, maybe the same response that most people listening to this conversation would have. And so what do you say to people who would like to imagine themselves as being able to bring together life in the real world with what they their own perception of themselves, that they have these deeply held Christian beliefs, but when it comes to something extreme, and it touches them personally in a way that they just could never have imagined, it being so awful, and they just can't do it. What would you say to someone like that?
I would say, boy, I was right there with you.
Yeah.
I was where I met Mark Osler was at this death penalty conference called Kairos. And it was all these faith groups from all over the country gathering at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, Martin Luther King Jr.'s church. And I was listening to this woman, Marietta Yeager, speak about the abduction and rape and murder and dismemberment of her little daughter, her 7-year-old daughter, Susie. And talking about praying for the person, the man who did it, and praying for his good. And I remember folding my arms and sitting back and going,
Right.
Sorry,
Right.
you are on a plane higher than I could ever attain.
Sure.
And then a murder, then, you
don't think that's going to happen to you.
Yeah. And so you don't know what God is capable of doing with your own heart in the moment. And here's how I came to it. The first week that Nancy, heard that she was dead, I stopped eating, I stopped sleeping. I had this nightmare going on a continuous loop in my head, this nightmare movie of Nancy, Richard opening their front door. It's dark. They see a shadowy figure. The gun is pointed at them. They're ordered to the basement. The gun goes off. Richard slumps to the floor. And this is playing over and over. And I went to the pastor of my church then, John Buchanan. And I sat in a study and I said, John, and I told him about the not eating and the sleeping and the movie playing in my head. And he said, it's too much for you. You can't bear up under this. You're holding on to it like this, gripping it close to you with your closed fist. You need to open your fist and raise your hands up and hold this up to God, this tragedy, and say, take this, do something with this. This is too much for me. I cannot do this alone. Redeem this. And
Wow.
I did not know when I did that, how powerfully God would answer that prayer. None of us know. So that's what I would say. If it's too much for you, to forgive, just hold it up to God and say,
Right.
help
I think about that sometimes. Yeah. praying to God, you're just going to have to do this for me sometimes.
Yeah.
You may have to forgive the things I cannot. I just don't feel like I have the willpower to do, and maybe that would change myself too in the
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, I mean, I love what Anne Lamott said, that, she said at first that there's only two prayers: thank you, thank you, thank you, and help me, help me, help me. Right. And then she added a third prayer. Wow.
Yeah, wow.
But the help me is where we are when we're struggling with our forgiveness, right?
That's true. Yeah. And I have two questions that people have put up here. One is, again, I'm sure you get this a lot, and you've already mentioned you've experienced sort of both sides of this, I think, in your own experience here. How do you think about forgiveness for people who are remorseful versus those who are not? Now, you said you had forgiven the killer of your sister before you even knew, that you didn't know anything, and he wasn't even remote. He wouldn't, even if you'd known, he wasn't remorseful. But
yeah, I know that some people feel that you can't and even shouldn't forgive someone until they're sorry. And all I have to do is look at Jesus on the cross.
Yeah.
He is hanging there dying, and the people surrounding him on the ground have not apologized to him.
Right.
No one said they're sorry. They're taunting him. Mm-hmm. They're gambling for his clothes. They're kind of looking at their watches like, hurry up and die, right? And he prayed for them, Father, forgive them.
There's this strange idea from the time of the English Reformation that it sounds backwards to us that forgiveness precedes repentance. And even in the words of the traditional words of the absolution and parts of the prayer book, after you've confessed your sins and the priest reminds you that you're forgiven, ask God to give you the gift of true repentance. It's kind of like the experience of the prodigal son who gets the embrace of the father before there's a prayer of confession or whatever, and is embraced with love, and then you think, well, now he's really sorry. It wasn't the pig pen experience, it was the experience of being embraced, and there's a kind of true repentance that comes on the other side of that. But I know that's a controversial point.
No, I love what the New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine, says about the prodigal son stories, that people think it's a story about an apology, and she said there wasn't an apology.
I know.
You didn't get to even make it, right?
One person said, is there a model of restorative justice somewhere that has been implemented with some success? So people have ideas about these things. Is there some place where you've seen maybe different models of things that have borne some fruit in some way?
Oh, yeah. I mean, my friend, the lawyer Tom Williams in Louisville, Kentucky, started this movement towards restorative justice, especially for juveniles, juvenile offenders in the criminal justice system. And it's within the context of the city of Louisville, which is intentionally called itself a city of compassion, meaning that at every level, in government, in the business community, in the not-for-profit sector, we all want to have this overarching ethos of compassion. Mm-hmm. And they've turned their entire criminal justice system for juveniles into a restorative justice system. Wow. The whole thing. And the place where I practice law as a public defender, Cook County, is starting to catch on to that. We started with one restorative justice court for juveniles. Now we have 3. And I'm hoping that we too will hopefully soon turn that whole system into that model, where you bring in the offender and the victim and the community and the families and everybody, so that we can restore them to community and fix what's wrong.
So that's more widespread than I mean, it's not just some idea someone's experimenting with. I guess they are, but it's in many places then.
Yes.
At the moment. Yeah. Interesting. Someone has a question similar to what I was trying to express earlier. Can you forgive a person, or try to, but still believe they should face the consequences of their actions under the law? And that's kind of what I was trying to get at about, even when I talk about grace in extreme ways, that doesn't mean I think that all prison cells should just be opened, or people should not go, face the consequences of their actions. But how do you, that causes a lot of controversy, I think, in people's, or they worry about it as a person of faith.
Yeah, absolutely not. No, forgiveness is not a get out of jail free card for, for what you've done. I mean, the person who killed Nancy and Richard and their baby has now served 30 years. And if you look at the 3 lives he's taken, that's only 10 years for each
Sure.
life. I mean, I'm fine with that. What forgiveness does is to say, I don't want to throw you away forever. I don't want to intentionally inflict suffering on you. I want there to be accountability. I want there to be responsibility. But I'm also not going to demonize you. I'm not going to, throw you out of the human family.
I think that's really important for people to hear, because I do think people sort of their imaginations get carried away as to what they think of what does this lead to, and everyone's always afraid that, I mean they want to do the right thing, and they don't always know what the right thing is.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I mean, what's that like? I guess you told once a story about, or you were talking about the murderer of your sister. He did not have a public defender, did he?
No,
Tell us, because this fits in, I think, a little bit to, how does the system work? And I thought that was interesting when I heard you talk about this once.
yeah, because he lived in this fairly affluent town of Winnetka. He had this father and a mother that could afford to hire the best attorney there is, which is a man named Robert Gebertz. He was a public defender, career public defender. He rose to the #2 public defender in the office before he left to go into private practice. And it's one of the things I write about in my book about the murder's change of heart, that on the eve of the trial, he and I happened to be at the same, cocktail party celebrating the 60th anniversary of the public defender's office, because I was a brand new public defender and he had been in the office before. And he asked someone who knew me if I would mind him coming over to introduce himself.
Wow.
And I said, no, of course I'll speak to him. And he came over and he shook my hand and he said, what I'm about to do, this trial defending, David Bureau, has nothing to do with how terrible I feel about what happened to your family.
Right.
And the loss of your sister and her husband. And that to me was the gold standard of being a defense lawyer. Be honest, be gracious, be thoughtful, reach out in compassion and express that human sympathy. So that was a real blessing.
Yeah. So do you feel like, I mean, it's always hard to, people want to get to the truth in a trial. And do you feel like part of that process necessarily involves not only a vigorous prosecution, but a vigorous defense as well? Like those two things go together.
Absolutely. When I heard that he had hired the best attorney around, I thanked God, because I thought the last thing I need is for some shoddy, sleazy, slipshod lawyer to, do a bad job, and then it'll be reversed on appeal. And then we'll have to go through this all again, a new trial where we're holding up the bloody clothes and holding up the gun and showing the pictures. And when the appellate court got the appeal from the conviction in the case, in the opinion, they stated that it was the most well-tried, error-free, almost perfectly tried case they'd ever seen.
Wow.
Between the really good prosecutors that we had on the case and the excellence of the defense lawyers. And I always tell people, if you want to be someone who helps avoid wrongful convictions, be a really good defense lawyer. Prevent the wrongful conviction from happening in the first place.
Do you mind telling us one other thing that I know, and I know this is difficult, but it was such a powerful way I've heard you describe this to others. You did not know about this at first, but later you learned a little more about your sister's final minutes, and that. Could you describe that, about the message that was?
Yeah. So I told you about the nightmare playing in my head of Nancy's last moments. And I thought in my earthly wisdom that they would have been moments of terror and of pain and of heartbreak and just astonished, abandoned misery. And about a week after her murder, the police told us a detail we didn't know. And that is that in her last moments, Nancy had dragged herself across the floor, because she was too weak to stand. And there were these bruises on her elbows and a blood trail of her journey painfully over to where her husband was laying. And in her last moments before she died, she dipped her finger in her own blood and drew the shape of a heart in the letter U on the floor next to him. And when I learned that, it changed everything for me, because I had been kind of raging at God until that moment of, where were you? Where were you when the gun was pointed at her, when the gun went off, when it ripped through her body? Where were you? And then when I heard about that, I knew where God was. God was right there with her. That's the only thing that could explain the strength and the serenity and the depth and the beauty of her being able to feel that love and right love. And I think not just for Richard and this baby she'd never know, but for us, all she loved, and the whole world that she loved so well.
Yeah, you once described that as a benediction. I think that's an image that I'll never forget.
Yeah.
And like you said, not just for everybody.
Yeah. And for everyone out there who is wondering, in a world where there's so much strife and there's so much hate, will love win, right?
Right.
And I just see that as the definitive answer to that the young man who killed her fled that night, probably thinking he'd silenced her forever, that he had the last word, that the bullets and the gun had the last word. And he was wrong. He didn't. She had the last word. And the last word was love, and always will be.
Well, amen to that. We'll let that be our benediction tonight then.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to say thank you, Jeanne, for joining us tonight. On behalf of Palmer, the congregation, the vestry, the staff, the clergy, we are grateful for your presence with us tonight. Listening to you made me think of just these few words that Mary Oliver wrote about instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. And I think you're doing that, and I am grateful that you're doing that. And so you've blessed us this evening with your presence and your story and your generosity and your graciousness. So thank you. And thank everybody else for joining in tonight. We are going to have a conversation about this conversation. We're going to talk about this on Sunday, following our worship and at the 12:30 hour. And we will be together from 12:30 to 1:30 and have that conversation. So please join us then if you can. So thank you, Jeanne, very much.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. Everybody have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.